I'm Eric Balchunas with Bloomberg Intelligence, Senior ETF Analyst, and I'm really excited today for this panel. We've got a look at the climate tech investment, and I can tell you from ETF flows and launches, this is a hot area and something that we're getting our heads around constantly. So this panel today is going to feature Jay Littman of Ethic, Sean Kidney of Climate Bonds, Shela Leka of iClima, Dan Barry of Spark Change, and Sylvia Jablonski of Defiance. And so the first thing I think of when I think of tech investment or climate tech investment is, are we going after companies that are doing this kind of work in making, helping with the climate change and making a greener future, companies that would be in, say, a solar ETF? Or are we taking our portfolio and surgically removing the dirty companies so that we can, quote, sleep at night better? And I think that's the crossroads I think of as an immediate question. I just want to start there and get everybody's take on which of those paths do you take? And I'll throw it to Sean to start off.
Well, there's a negative and a positive. On the negative side, if you've got heft, if you're an institutional investor, your primary responsibility is first to engage and get them to change. We do need to really rapidly get out of fossil fuels. And let's get these companies thinking about different corporate strategies. And if they won't, then you divest. Personally, as an individual, hey, I've got an ethical position. I've removed all fossil fuels from my portfolio. I consider it the same as investing in landmines, or rather cluster landmines. And we need to be thinking about that kind of future. But the real job is to shift to green, massively grow what green is. The lack of opportunity at the moment, but let's do reverse inquiry. Say to everyone, give me more, give me more, give me more, because the only way we fix the planet is rapidly shift to large-scale green investments. And then there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. The science is clear. So we're at 56 gigatons of emissions today, and we have to reach half that target annually by 2030. The world is on board, regulators are on board, and consumers are increasingly aware and driving this trend. So what we see at iClima is this seismic shift. It's not a gentle sort of slow transition. It's a massive transformational shift that's occurring to a low carbon economy. And so what we think of is, what are the solution providers? So to your point, it's renewable energy assets. Yes, it's solar, but it's also sustainable agriculture, it's plant-based diets, it's electric vehicles, it's sustainable packaging. And what we look at are all those solution providers for two reasons. One, it's because what the world needs, and we measure their impact in terms of carbon avoidance. That's our metric. But second, we see these companies as the winners. These are the ones that are going to win in the long term because their solutions are what the world needs and increasingly what people are going to move towards.
Yeah, no, I agree with everyone's points, especially Shela's point that, sustainable companies are not necessarily companies that are saving the world. They are companies that are just more responsibly run and positioned better for the long term, right? They're mitigating risks. They're investing in using less energy and having less lawsuits. But I think that, in order to have the kind of impact that we want to and need to have around these topics, we cannot be talking about billions of dollars transitioning into them, right? We need to be talking about trillions of dollars.
So we don't really think the Crossroads framework is a little bit too simplistic. If you have trillions of dollars of asset managers already committing to net zero aligned portfolios, etc. But if you did the analysis, perhaps only about 10% of the equity universe would be investable if you followed that sort of positive screening or negative screening framework. And all the money out there can't fit into such a small pocket. So the way we look at it is asset managers, asset owners should reallocate to the extent they're possible, that they're comfortable without destroying value.
90% of the world's energy consumption comes from fossil fuels, which are not renewable and they're essentially bad for the environment. We're talking about emissions control, and one way to reduce emissions is to focus on carbon, and you need an offset for that. So one of the offsets we believe is hydrogen, and hydrogen as a future energy source is a super interesting path to explore. So right now there's about a $200 billion investment in hydrogen. We think that by 2050, that'll look like an $11 trillion investment, and that 25% of the world's energy consumption will come from hydrogen.
Well, that was just a little taste of what you're going to see. And I also want to stress that what our goal is to really go over how to have a conversation with your clients about some of these ways to do this type of investment, the different ways to look at performance, the implementation, the differences between the indexes and how they're constructed, as well as different types of green investment like hydrogen, solar, wind, and the different asset classes in which you can use to do this. So you should come over to our panel. I guarantee you'll like it. Real quick, just to the panelists, I'm gonna let you introduce yourselves, but as I throw a question out and you wanna chime in, go ahead and just lift your finger and we'll let you right in rather than me having to call on each person for every question. Sort of like a debate, I guess, but we don't need to get too debatey. But anyway, all right. Let's start. I would go around the horn. Just tell everybody a little bit about yourself before we begin with the questions, and we'll go what looks like clockwise to me. So start with Sylvia.
Hi, Eric. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. My name is Sylvia Jablonski, and I am the Chief Investment Officer of Defiance ETFs. Prior to Defiance, I was at a company called Direction ETFs. So I've spent the better part of the last, 15 years working in ETFs. One of the focuses that we have on Defiance is coming out with products such as related to hydrogen and energy, and that's something I'll be talking a little bit about today.
Sean?
I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds. We're the global NGO for green bonds and climate bonds. Work of governments, investors, banks, right around the world.
Jay? Oh, wait, Jay, can you hear me? We can't hear you, or at least I can't. Can you guys hear him? Jay, can you? Oh, yeah, there we go. All right.
Sorry.
Good to go.
Hey, Eric. Hey, everyone. Sorry about that. Jay Lippman, co-founder and president of Ethic Investing. We are a sustainable asset manager that essentially helps investors to align their portfolios with their values. And we do so by partnering with advisors to help them through that process of defining their values, understanding where their money is and where their money can be, ultimately investing in separately managed accounts that replicate index performance and exposure.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shella Lika. I'm the COO of iClimate Earth. We're a relatively new company. We create our own proprietary indices. And what we're trying to do is look for the solutions that can help decarbonize the planet. And also we look to quantify that. And we're a sponsor of ETFs launching soon in the US.
All right, and Dan.
Hi everyone, I'm Dan Barry, Chairman of Spark Change. As Jim said, not to be confused with Spark Network. My background actually, I used to work for the dark side. I ran BP's Environmental Commodities division for the best part of 5 years, and before that with Gazprom. I've since set up Spark Change to focus on finding alternative solutions for people to meet their environmental targets, predominantly focusing on carbon as a commodity.
Great. And by the way, I think you can just ask questions if they come up. I'll be looking at the chat section here. If you have any, just ask away. Let's start with a basic one. I'll open it with Jay, but again, everybody, if you want to chime in, just raise your finger and I'll call on you. Jay, how do we talk about this, or should advisors talk about this with their clients? Obviously, it's a whole new world. There's all these trends that come out in investing. It can be confusing. And when it comes to ESG or climate investing, I've heard some people say it's for your values, so you can sleep at night. And then I've heard other people say, well, it's because you outperform. Then I've heard, well, because it's less risky that way. So what are we doing here? What's really the ultimate objective, and how should you talk to your clients about it?
It's a fantastic question, Eric. And, we spend a lot of time with advisors helping them to understand how to engage with clients around this to make it not only exciting, but also palatable, right? At the end of the day, these are our investments that we are hoping to, really keep us going for not just 10 years, but this is our retirements, right? This is 30 years, this is 50 years, this is the money we want to actually give to our children, our children's children. And because of that, as we look at climate, as we look at the kind of risks that exist as it pertains to climate, do you want to be investing in companies that are either ignoring those risks or going to be massively susceptible to the damages that come from a changing climate, from extreme weather events, from damages to the supply chain? And so as an advisor, I think that positioning this as, look, as your advisor, I want what's best for you. I want to build a portfolio that is really thinking about the long term. Therefore, we're going to be taking climate into consideration and actually proactively trying to mitigate some of the risks that we know climate poses to some of these, core business plans in many cases, and we're going to try and remove as much of that from the portfolio as possible. And the second thing I'll just add to that is, actually positioning this to what connects with the client's life, right? Because a lot of the time talking about carbon capture, talking about these specific strategies won't resonate to an average investor, but connecting it to the fact that they like to go skiing, or they like to be outdoors in nature, or they may even like to hunt, means that they have a vested interest in actually preserving the world that they want to be around for their children. So that's how we position it for advisors to have that conversation and engage with their clients.
Go for it.
Thanks, Eric. I was just going to build on what Jay said. I think that's absolutely right. We see ESG very much as a risk. It's a present risk that's starting to become more quantified. And right now there's that lack of consensus, which sometimes makes it difficult about what ESG means. It can mean so many things. And different people have, I guess, different ways of looking at it. But I just wanted to add, from iClimate Earth's perspective, we also see at least the environmental trend, the E part of it, as an opportunity. So not just a risk, but we are trying to say, well, this is a seismic shift as we see it happening in the world. It's not a gentle, slow transition to a green economy. What we're witnessing is a massive disruption. And the former head of the WTO calls it an inflection point. So, for instance, right now, 75% of the world economy has a decarbonization plan. 18 months ago, that was 25%. Today, half of the assets under management, investment managers representing 52 under management, have joined an organization where they're committing and moving their portfolios to net zero. So we see a massive shift happening. And what we're trying to also say to advisors is, where are the opportunities? If this is in fact happening and there's a massive transition happening, what are the solutions that will be providing that transition or enabling that transition to happen?
So let me jump in real quick there, because when you talk about opportunities, I guess I also think of the difference between ESG, which is what Jay described as removing companies, versus going after, say, solar or wind energy companies that, like a Tesla, companies that are sort of, and that kind of a fund will be more volatile, obviously. That's a different kind of a play. I'll go to Sylvie on that, since you guys have a hydrogen ETF, and you wouldn't replace your Vanguard 500 fund with that because it's going to be a little more volatile, but explain how that would fit into this investing. Oh, you got to unmute.
There we go. Shelley made a great point. I think that just one further point to this is that it will become, or it feels like it's going to become, a responsibility. There's a lot of talk about global countries and the various continents to become carbon neutral by 2050. So if it is in fact a responsibility that we all adhere to, the investment opportunity will be huge, and then the impact on the environment obviously will be huge there. But in terms of what we do at Defiance, we created this hydrogen ETF, to your point, to invest in the companies that do seek to make this new use, transfer, and storage of energy a reality. So we look at fuel cell companies, we look at companies that help store, produce hydrogen as a renewable energy source. So, our view on this is basically that 90% of the world's energy consumption comes from fossil fuels, which are basically bad for the environment. And a good replacement to reduce emissions is looking at green hydrogen. So, we sort of looked at that, what that means, how it's made, and created a basket of stocks that invest in that revolution. So to your point, it won't replace your basic S&P 500 exposure, but it'll be a great complement and I think early stage investment opportunity in your future energy investment allocation.
Anybody, I'll throw this out there for anybody, but the idea of, let's say you have this portfolio in the 60-40. 60% is the Vanguard 500, and 40% is like the Barclays Ag ETF. So BND and VU or something like that. Sean or Dan, anybody, do you guys have any take on, should you sell that and put in a much more energy or climate conscious fund there, or would you add it on top of your Vanguard fund? Sean, you want to take a shot at that?
Look, Eric, we have a kind of existential risk in front of us. You talk about risk and you talk about values. I mean, the values here is I want to still be alive in 30 years' time. I want my kids to be alive, which is a kind of substantive issue. It's not just something I believe in. And when we look at climate change, what we're talking about is two kinds of risks that wash across everything. One is, of course, the impact of climate change. That's the lesser risk. But we're beginning to feel that. You know, the pandemic itself is a climate incident. It's rooted in pathogens jumping between species. This is an example of an exogenous risk affecting our economies, because it's starting here. Climate change won't be linear, it'll be jagged, but more directly for the purposes here, and this affects Sylvia's hydrogen ETF, it's policy risk. Will one of those 110 countries focused on net zero by 2050 now act? Well, the chances are a reasonable number are going to act. And what we now know from the last 15 years of solar change, which is a result of government action in Germany and China, is that a whole lot of change is going to come through and you've got to stay ahead of it. So if you want to just retain value in your portfolio, let alone increase value, you're going to need to look at different places to where you're looking now. So to answer your question, you've got to unpick what's happening in the Vanguard index to work out, are they overexposed to sectors that are going to go down because of policy risk? And how do I increase my exposure, which might mean shifting different sorts of ETFs or indices to this, to sectors that are going to grow? Of course, you've still got the risk between incumbents, small players, all those sorts of things. I don't know, I'm a fixed income guy mainly rather than equities. These are equities people here. But risk, for God's sake, we have an extraordinary existential risk facing our societies. We are going to see wholesale decimation of industries in the next 15 years. I mean, this is not values, mate. This is risk on steroids that we're looking at here, volatility on steroids, and that's what we've got to try and deal with. The only question is, are we going to make this transition, which will unsheath a volume of opportunities, or are we going to miss it, in which case we're better off investing in small arms manufacturing and dredging in Miami?
And I actually had a question for you, but you go ahead and give me your thought, and then I'm going to come right back to you with something. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to point out that, where is a lot of this risk? What is the instrument coming here? There was talk about the Biden administration. One of the primary policy tools being used to help with this transition, incentivize the right behaviors, is putting a price on carbon. You've seen in Europe, prices have already risen from the low single digit euros to over 40 euros for the cost of polluting 1 ton of CO2. You have similar policy instruments starting in China and the US. An alternative to looking to reallocate your portfolio is to invest in the instrument itself, have an exposure to the carbon price. Not only does that help incentivize further escalation of carbon pricing, but it also helps change behaviors across the entire economy. So you can be part of the solution by investing in something that neutralizes your financial exposure, but then also incentivizes change to happen faster. So that's just a different way of looking at the problem. You
bring up a good point, which is largely what I wanted to ask you. And you worked in the dark side, so BP, right? So I love the way you introduced yourself. Now, Exxon is a company that comes up in my world a lot. And I read somewhere they have the most climate scientists, and also they would obviously, if motivated, could be a player in making things greener. What do you say to somebody who says, well, why would I not want to own that company? I'll own it until regulations or consumer demand force the issue for Exxon, and then I won't need to go back and re-own it.
That's spot on. Is that a lot of these companies will, to Sean's point, will be decimated and fall away, but a lot of them will be part of the solution. The key thing is they need to be pressured or incentivized to be part of the solution, not try and swim against the current. And it's the carbon price, it's the cost of polluting and doing what they do today versus using their power to shift to something new that incentivizes that change. And that's why at Spark Change, we really focus on how do we bring that carbon price to the mainstream, have all investment managers integrate carbon price into their portfolio. Whether they're switching to new instruments or just sticking with what they've got, they can still affect change by being part of that sort of trajectory to create the right incentives for the financial markets and the companies that operate in it.
And Jay, I want to come back to you. I know we talked earlier, you do something to the effect of custom indexing, which is interesting and something I'm like, well, if you're a ESG and it can be subjective. So to work with a client, and that's what we're seeing direct indexing be a solution for. But talk about this subjectivity between index makers. Obviously, they do it differently. I looked at 3 or 4 different ESG ETFs recently, and the top 20 stocks they exclude are all different. And so talk about how to sort of line up what would work and someone's value with basically the objectivity or the different ways these indexes are designed.
One of the issues with ESG is that, it's binary as carbon exposure, right? ESG covers everything from the environmental, the social, and the governance. So you've got everything in between that, right? You've got the climate side, you've got greenhouse gases, deforestation. On the social side, you have gender equity, you have racial injustice. On the governance side, quality of leadership, transparency, these kinds of things that define how well a business is actually run. Because it is such a wide gamut of issues, it basically comes down to a subjective interpretation of what to weigh most highly when you define that ESG and then implement it into an index, which is why we actually founded Ethic, because we realized that no 2 people really have exactly the same values. No 2 organizations are going to have exactly the same definition of what should matter over something else. Everyone has a unique view of what matters most. I think everyone on this panel will probably prioritize climate change to a pretty high regard, but the ability to then customize it around what you care about is really what it is that we do, right? We create these custom indexes that reflect what it is that you prioritize, whether it's deforestation over carbon exposure, over certain other issues. And that is why customization is so important, I think, in this transition to more sustainable portfolios, because one size fits all doesn't necessarily get the most people on board when they don't feel like that one size reflects who they are. Because at the end of the day, in order for us to have the biggest impact here, we need to get trillions of dollars moving in the right direction. And that means that you've got to get everyone understanding how this connects to them, as opposed to a small, very, very energized group moving what is ultimately going to be a smaller pool of capital. And that's why we think that customization element is going to get more investors bought in, recognizing that something like climate is fundamental and, to Sean's point, existential, facing our portfolios that we need to solve for, no matter what it is that your values are.
I believe you make the indexes. Correct me if I'm wrong. So give me your take. You're tasked with making an index, and you have to take some of this into account. How do you do it?
So the way we went about it is we felt that there was a little bit of a void when it came to actually coming up with a quantitative solution that was also thoughtful in how diversified it was across different solutions that can help with the decarbonization. So we started from a top-down approach, and we relied on scientific studies, Project Drawdown, to identify the sectors that we thought will make the greatest impact. And we looked at it from what we call a revenue basis. So we looked for the companies providing solutions that were providing products and services to help others bring down carbon, as opposed to companies for whom decarbonization is a cost element. So we were looking for those revenue drivers. And we looked beyond renewable energy. So we were trying to find, across our 28 subsectors, we were looking for a wide range of solutions. So we have renewable energy, of course, but we also have water and wastewater. We have green transport. We have things like battery storage, electrical components, the software that allows you to use energy more efficiently. So a host of different solutions. And so our first index has 158 different listed companies that are across this broad spectrum. And from that top-down approach, we then went bottom-up, identifying the companies that would work within each of those categories. And that's how we did it. And then we spent the past year quantifying what their impact was. And for us, the most important metric is potential avoided emissions. And we rely heavily on the work of Mission Innovation, the gentleman by the name of Dennis Palman there, who's done some great work. And we think it's a really powerful way of looking at a solution, not just because of the impact it makes, because basically what you say, through, like this Zoom call or through this technology that we're using right now, we're avoiding a large conference and all the emissions that would have gone with that. And so that avoided emissions is one way of looking at how one solution can help reduce carbon in the world. So we think it's a very powerful way of quantifying what a company's impact is, not just from the pure impact perspective, which is of course very important to us, but also, again, going back to what I said originally, these are the companies that are going to be needed, that are going to be growing, and are going to be the winners in this seismic shift that's taking place.
Sean, you do the bonds, okay? And when we look at ETFs, there's probably, I want to say about 180 ESG equity ETFs and maybe 5 fixed income ETFs. What should we be thinking about on the bond side of the portfolio when it comes to this?
Well, there's about 5 green bond ETFs, so there must be a few more on the ESG side. I hope so, God's sake. Green bonds, climate bonds, which is a slice of what we need to do on the fixed income side, are growing exponentially. There's like 1.1 trillion globally now. It's no longer a niche thing. Of course, green bonds are growing too. Sustainability bonds, social bonds, transition bonds, they're all linked together. What we simply need to do is twofold. One is we need to recognize what to do. Now, I'm separating this from risk for a moment. To understand what the future lower risk universe is going to look like, you need to understand what the change imperatives are. You need to know that we need to move to H2, green hydrogen. It's going to happen. In fact, it's going to happen at extraordinary speed, but that's a separate question we can talk about. Once you understand what are the kind of things society is going to have to do, decarb, yes, but what does it mean in practice? Energy storage, for example, induction cooktops, these are all part of the decarb agenda. Then you get a sense of what the universe to play in. So first you have to work out the universe to play in, the prioritized universe. That'll give you a clue about what universe to look twice at and maybe exit in some cases. When you look at Exxon has been an extraordinary paragon of value loss for the last 10 years. As you know, NextEra exceeded the value of Exxon just recently on the New York Stock Exchange. Pivotal moment, the change here. NextEra is a renewable energy company, for God's sake. Exxon has made a lot of really bad decisions by not shifting with the times. The times are driven by policy and about the imperatives of change arising out of policy. So this is what I mean by understanding the sandboxes. There will, of course, still be things that will make money on the negative ledger side. There'll be a lot more that will make money on the positive environmental ledger side. I call it make it easy. Now, all of these guys are in that space. So within what these guys are doing, where are the opportunities lying? Well, in the fixed income space, fixed income issuers are big companies, not small companies, and governments. You're essentially calibrating your risk and looking for value retention. You're not looking for yield. Larry Fink once said he made money not by giving people yield, by making sure they didn't lose their money. So we've already got that happening with the green bonds market. Green bonds in secondary markets perform better. In downturns, they hold their value. In the middle of the crisis last March, they were still liquid. All the other bonds froze. So you've already got the characteristics showing up as to why you should be in these bonds and other bonds if you're simply in it for the value retention, which of course every fixed income investor is. When you translate it to equities, I'm going to say you're going to have to look at the ETFs. You're going to have to look at the specialist groups tracking this, and you're going to have a real understanding of risk versus opportunity in this. And there's no simple answer on that, except I'm going to say, don't forget resilience. Don't forget resilience when looking at it. It's not just decarb, because we're moving into a world of extreme volatility. And the only question now is whether that volatility becomes catastrophic rather than extreme. So there's a bunch of investments that are going to have to be made, which will create opportunities for people. Water efficiency. Water is going to become floods and then drought everywhere. So that means that everywhere is going to have a greater demand for water efficiency investments. We're going to have to look at industrial food. The pandemic shows us when crises happen, you've got to be able to get your food reasonably locally. Supply chains get disrupted. So urban farming is going to become important. Boy, have we learned that farmers are good investments in the last year. Now that's already been priced in, but nevertheless gives you a flavor of the sort of things you've got to be looking at on the resilience side as well. So I'm a big fan of Sylvia's H2, but there's a wide range of things we've got to tackle.
Hydrogen is something I'm going to guess maybe not everybody's up to speed on. I know solar, wind, clean energy, there's an idea of what you're buying when you get one of those, but how does this work, and what's the sort of bull case for it?
Sure. And, a quick comment. I really like what, Shayla and Jay mentioned about customizing indices and products for people to sort of pick what they want to invest in and match their sort of moral values with their investment thesis. But as a follow-up to what Sean just discussed, there is in reality a very big movement towards hydrogen, and that's part of the global battle to preserve the world and reduce emissions. And it's thought that what is now $150 billion investment will be an $11 trillion investment, and the EU is investing $1 trillion. Japan and Korea are investing in this. US in office is putting hundreds of millions in dollars towards this. So I do think that it's becoming more of a reality in terms of an investment opportunity that will pan out, sort of in the near future anyway. But in terms of, sort of what is it? So a good question that we often get is like, well, what is it? What is it actually used for now? Does it exist now? So, now you have, hydrogen can be used to heat a house. It can be used to provide hydrogen fueled motors that run forklifts, and companies like NASA, Amazon, and Walmart are using them in their warehouses. It can back up the energy at a data center. Cars can run on hydrogen. So it touches transportation, heating, oil, energy conservation, energy storage, all of these sorts of things. And the way it's made essentially is interesting, and it feeds into why it's sort of good for the earth, right? So again, 90% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. They have emissions, right? So they're sort of bad for the environment. With hydrogen, sort of the easy way to put it is through electrolysis, and if renewable energy is used, it's considered green hydrogen, where you're splitting hydrogen and oxygen from water. Later on, there's a transfer to a fuel cell where there's this catalyst, and you have protons and electrons that are split. The electrons pass through a current, create electricity. When the protons and electrons meet on the other side, essentially you get water, or the emission from that is water. So water is obviously not bad for the earth. So again, if you have renewable energy that's fueling the electrolysis process, you have green hydrogen, and it's thought that the costs are going down, the investments in it are going up, and the technology is increasing, so that eventually 25% of our energy can come from hydrogen.
All right, Dan, let's go to you. We talked equities, fixed income, and you do commodities. Tell me where you're coming from in the commodity world, and how we should be thinking about that asset class here.
Absolutely. So I think everybody on the call will be familiar with physical gold ETFs or ETCs, exchange traded commodities. Effectively, at Spark Change, we're creating the world's first physical carbon ETF, ETC. So that is, your fund unit is one-to-one backed by a carbon allowance issued by the regulator. And I think everyone will have seen in the last year, carbon as a commodity has been one of the highest performing asset classes in the world. I think the FT and The Economist have run articles about it being the one-way bet for investors. And that's because basically everyone except for Exxon and BP want the price to go one direction, and most importantly, it's the regulator that wants the price itself to be going north, because it's what they need in order for this change to occur. So what we do is, coming back to your original point, different investors have different investment theses. Am I investing for absolute returns? Do I want an alternative investment asset class? Am I looking to manage risk? Am I looking to invest with impact? We then provide the analytics and tools that allow you to understand how to integrate carbon into your portfolio. So let's say I want to continue to hold Chevron, Exxon, or stocks, but I want to know what their exposure is to a carbon price in Europe, in US, in China. We have the tools that would allow you to effectively strip out that carbon price exposure so that they can continue to hold the stock, but then further also incentivize by creating scarcity of those carbon allowances at a higher carbon price, but then not having exposure as the carbon price goes up, and that stock's operating profit gets impacted by the escalating carbon price. That's a risk management tool. If you wanted to invest for absolute returns, all sorts of different ways in which we can do analytics and help you understand how to hold that commodity within your equities or fixed income portfolio.
While we're on this topic, you read a lot lately about how crypto is not really good for the planet. What's your take on that? I mean, I'll just assume for the time being that crypto is in your world a commodity. What do you think?
So, I think that really, absolutely. I mean, bottom line, Bitcoin and Ethereum or Ether not good for the planet at all. Obviously, there's a second generation of cryptos coming out. I'm not a crypto expert. I think the key thing is people are desperately looking for alternative asset classes right now. You've seen a lot go into gold. You've seen a lot go into Bitcoin. And effectively carbon allowances are the same sort of uncorrelated asset class. And in fact, they're one which the regulator that creates them wants to give it a certain push in a certain direction. So we see a lot of people who are looking for absolute returns coming to our having interest in our products simply because it's an alternative as well.
I saw the GLD people put out a whole thing about how they're more ESG than crypto. So I foresee a battle of the commodities on who is better for the planet coming up. Let's go to a real quick side question, and that's something you talked about: hydrogen, solar, wind, and maybe Sean, I feel like you might have a take on this. What about nuclear energy and uranium? We've seen the uranium ETFs just go crazy in the past year, and I've seen Bill Gates talk about how this is a clean way to do it. Obviously, there's public fears, but anybody have a take on that? I'll start with Sean, but anybody can chime in on whether nuclear will play a role.
Well, there's two separate issues. One is the environmental role, and one is the nature of the risk. And they are a bit separate when it comes to uranium. I'm going to say from an environmental perspective, look, uranium, or rather nuclear power, is low carbon. Let's be clear about that. Don't get caught up in those kinds of arguments. Whether it's environmentally good by the time you take into account waste disposal, decommissioning challenges, all of those sort of things, that is another matter. We'll call that impact on the impact on the environment. Do no significant harm in European parlance. And my own view is I would rather see us building a nuclear plant than a coal plant. But the truth is, it takes 10 years to build a nuclear plant. The amount of uranium we've got available to us for current technologies is quite small. We can do about 8% of the world's energy using uranium. So it's a bit of a red herring. It's a provocative red herring to get us all arguing with each other. So let's not worry too much about it. And on the risk side, that also means it's not going to be a growth stock like a fintech company, because there's actually only so much we can get done with uranium, and it takes a hell of a long time, and it's really expensive. So I would say from a credit and risk perspective, you'd probably be careful. Now, there may well be some new technologies coming through. You read about the occasion which look fantastic, but you've got to put that in the basket of high risk, like a bunch of high risk opportunities are coming through, in which case that depends on your risk appetite. This is not exactly investing in wind or solar. This is not exactly investing in electric mobility. This is a niche play, really.
Well, this looks like it's in your wheelhouse. So we have this, we want to get to this place in the future. Sean just talked about nuclear would be 8% tops. Can you break down the other ways we get there between wind, solar? Like, how are you designing the funds to meet that, whatever that percentage will look like down the road?
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, I agree with the nuclear position. I think it's true. It does lower emissions in the world, but at what cost? And if you're going to wait 10 years and spend billions on that, wouldn't that be better spent on solutions that exist now, are available? And secondly, when you look at things like wind and solar, you see that they're deflationary. So the cost of those things have been coming down. The cost of solar has come down 90% in the last decade, and it's declining further and further. And when you look at sort of our traditional energy systems, the current grid, the increasing demands that's going to be placed on that with the advent of electric vehicles, with the advent of efficient heat sources in the houses. In the UK, there's regulation where all new houses now have to have efficient heat pumps. You can't use the old boiler system. So there's demands on the grids now that can't be kept up with our current systems. And the cost, therefore, of replacing this old technology is just going higher and higher. Whereas these new solutions, it continues to go lower. So if you look in the future, I think that solar is going to play a big part in that, and it should, as the cost continues to decrease as we move towards what's known as distributed energy, distributed generation, where basically energy is generated at the point of use. So if you think of residential solar panels on your roof, and electric vehicles, not just as a source of generating energy, but also as a source of storing that energy and supplying back to your house, as well as to the grid itself when it's needed. And then all the kind of ecosystem that goes around that, ways of monitoring, using it efficiently, again, the software. So that's in fact the second index that we've created is right around that. And so we see distributed energy generation as a massive growth area. And for instance, in California, we expect that to be in the next 10 years, 35% of how generation is going to be, how energy is going to be generated and consumed. And we see that kind of moving across the world. And it could also be an excellent solution in emerging markets and developing countries where the grid is not actually well placed to deal with the demands of those kind of growing needs as well.
Let's talk about this word that you're hearing a little more about, greenwashing. I think you've heard it a few couple times. It's come up recently. You're probably best suited to look at this. You have to identify companies that you want out and companies that are okay. How do you determine the ones that are okay are really okay?
Well, I think it goes to like the power and the importance of data in this world, right? As we all create investment strategies, right? Whether it's hydrogen focused or whether it's generally climate focused, carbon focused, we want to be making those decisions with the most possible information as it pertains to the issues we're trying to cover. And so where we see, greenwashing, and we're again not prescribing greenwashing to any individuals or groups, because ultimately the people in these firms that may be guilty of this, they're trying their best with the resources they have. We don't think that people are, trying to create products that are not as effective or as impactful as they can be, but there's just constraints to the way that they have access to data or the way that they use data. So the way that we look at it is, why don't we gather as much data as we possibly can across the number of issues that we cover? And so whether it is something like carbon, whether it is something like gender equity, how do we actually gather a breadth of issue area data so that we're not just looking at something like, board level representation of women, and we're actually looking at all the issues that do affect women as it pertains to that social issue. Or with carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at everything as it pertains to climate and the environment, not just that single carbon score, but also biodiversity, whether they're contributing to deforestation, whether they're accelerating that process through slash and burn deforestation tactics. So what we think the solution to this is when you say that your portfolio is climate oriented or social oriented, it's actually digging deep into all the issues that are interconnected with solving that problem at a systemic level, and then using as much data as you possibly can to actually understand which companies are either on the right side of that or on the wrong side of that. And in that way, trying our best to avoid greenwashing.
Now, what about a company like Tesla? There was an article just the other day that they use they're dirtier than it looks, basically. Even though you're getting these electric cars, they're actually contributing a lot of carbon in the meantime, or in the build up to making that car. What's your take on that situation?
God, you're throwing me to the wolves here. This is going to either make a lot of people angry, a lot of people sad, or happy. But I think that it depends on what you're prioritizing, right? At a systemic level, Tesla is taking the world at a faster pace than we would have otherwise gone towards a more sustainable energy future, right? You're seeing GM, you're seeing I forget the other, Ford, you're seeing, right, these companies are now becoming electric vehicle companies. Why is that? It is quite directly because of the success of Tesla. And they're pulling the world in that direction, which we absolutely need, right, in order to address the decarbonization that needs to happen in internal combustion engine cars. But every company is multifaceted, right? Every company has various issues they're combating, and the methodology for pulling us in that direction, it may not be perfect. And so it depends on exactly what the investor is trying to achieve as it relates to that company. And if it is, accelerating the transition to a more sustainable energy future, that company may be positioned well to do so. But if there are more idiosyncratic elements of what that client is trying to achieve or have reflected in their issue areas with that portfolio, there are certain elements of the company in question that may not pass that. But that's why customization is so important.
And Dan, let's bring you back in. I can see you over there. So a question for you about, you look at carbon credits, and that's part of a regulatory atmosphere, which I think everybody agrees we need. But then there's the also consumption, changing how people act in their own lives, and then the investment piece. Can you maybe talk about those three working in tandem? In particular, the consumption part, how much do people need to change and make inconvenient choices?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the hardest issue associated with climate change, right? Is changing people's individual behaviours and our sort of natural propensity to consume. in sort of the society and culture we have today. I think the utopian future is that, everybody gets their own personal carbon allowance, and you can have some sort of carbon trading mechanism between each of us. So if I want to take my holiday to Barbados or wherever it is, then I'm going to have to pay somebody else to not go on holiday that year. But I think we're obviously a long way away from that. So I think realistically, the solution, in my point of view, comes from the regulators. I think the regulators themselves, both directly through placing caps and limits on sectors of the economy, need to force the decarbonisation, and then the financial services sector themselves, to Sean's point, they just need to draw a line in the sand to say we're going to stop investing in certain areas, which in turn is probably because regulators are requiring them to do so. I think there is a lot of goodwill from the bottom up, but the scale of the change required is going to force companies. That's going to force companies to change. I think has to come from the top down, in my opinion.
Great, yeah. That carbon credit trading between people is that's definitely future. I could see it though. Actually, I would be able to sell. I think we just take little car trips to the shore. We don't travel that much by plane. But anyway, Shella, you want to jump in here? Go ahead.
Just a quick point, just adding on that, what I'm always amazed at is in my everyday conversations, even before we started this company, I was shocked at the number of people who were coming up and just saying that they've gone meat free for one day of the week, and they had nothing to do with anything related to carbon. And I saw that kind of around the world, places that I traveled and people I came across. So I guess flipping your question on the head, I personally believe very much in markets. I think that people, will be incentivized to do what, the regulation demands, but that people should be allowed to make choices and hopefully not have to pay more for a holiday, because we all really miss having one right now. So I would hope I wouldn't have to pay more for that. But flipping that on the head, I'm always amazed at how much it matters to people who aren't interested in this industry and globally. And for me, that it very much kind of typifies that consumer element, the tailwind. There's regulation, there's investors demanding change. And what I thought was fascinating is there was a study done by, I think they were advisors to the UK on Davos this year, that said that more than regulation, it's actually investor demand that's encouraging companies, and that engagement, going and demanding certain change. And when you see Ford, the third largest automaker in the world, saying it's going net zero by 2050 and putting 11 billion between now and the end of next year into electrifying its fleet and creating the largest public network of charging stations, that's more than just, regulation demanding that. That's people saying, we want this choice. So for me, I always find that fascinating.
Actually, that's not fully true. The electric vehicle fleet globally is being driven because of very strong state action in a number of key countries, and it's washing over the US. People like places like Norway, for example, where the subsidies mean that 50% of all vehicles sold are electric vehicle. But more importantly, China, where state policy is to shift the country away from energy security, away from petrol to electric vehicles. They're driving the price changes, and Tesla's reaping the award of that and doing a good job from a market perspective. But let's be clear about where this is actually happening. It's not happening in market forces. And most of the stuff you've seen in the last 15 years, like the dramatic reduction in solar prices, which is helping electric vehicles, by the way, and battery prices and so on, is because of strong state action. When we look at what we've got to do now, we are not going to do it by, Eric, you eating less meat, by individual decisions. The impact will be you eating less meats, because we will need to change our society dramatically over the last 20 years. But it's not going to be by each one of us making a call, I will change my lifestyle. It's about changing systems. And systems are changed by a mixture of market forces. I agree with Sheila to that extent, but by strong action. The nature, the rapidity of what we have to do absolutely depends on further strong state action. And the reason why investors are pushing forward is not because they think it's a good idea or market force will change, it's because they believe that if Ford doesn't change, state action will blindside them. It's policy risk that's driving all of this. It's the risk that governments are going to act in places that freak out and frighten investors and we've got to stay ahead of it. And that's the underpinning about why we're changing, but also that's the lesson learned. Now, I do try and eat less meat. I've shifted my portfolio into an ethical fund and so on. I don't invest in any fossil fuels, but I'm under no illusion that that makes a big difference to the system. That's a moral position. That's not a change position. To change things, we have to change the systems that we do. Now, of course, for these guys, it's about looking for opportunities that flow out of those changes. But just bear that in mind. And your job as a citizen, if you want to see change, if you think this is a generally existential threat to you, is not to change your meat-eating habits, well, that might be a good moral position. It's to look at how you can vote the right government in.
Sylvia, I think you had your finger up. I could not tell.
Yeah, I just had a quick thought. So I agree that, as we sit here today, all of that is true. But if I think about the future, I think, Shela's point is a stronger one, because there will be this societal shift into a next generation. When we're sort of too old and our money has trickled down to the generations after us, even now, some of the younger colleagues that we've hired over the years, this is all they care about. This is all they talk about. They're horrified at how poor our recycling habits are. They're horrified that, we continue to buy cars that are not electric vehicles. And I think that that's a situation where it is more than one person. And when you have 60 trillion of wealth going down to, young Gen Z, millennial and beyond, I think that will drive the difference. And, those people are enough to make the difference if they don't eat meat once a week. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. But today, I agree with Sean, we almost have to be bullied into it.
Dan, I think I'm recollecting, I think you had your finger earlier up when Sean was speaking. Do you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm what Sean was saying, is that I think the problem, maybe also a little bit with the demographic and where we're all based, is if you rely on market mechanisms, when we stop filling up our car with Exxon gasoline, they just shift to Indonesia, India, Nigeria, where you've got people buying their first mopeds and then upgrading to their first car, and then eventually in 20 years' time, they've got enough affluence to upgrade to their SUVs, etc. Leaving it to markets, I think it's definitely a drive that with consumer values in some of them in the more developed markets changes. But I think Sean's absolutely right. The most impact you will have is by voting in the governments that will tackle this in an international context, put policies in place and drive action straight, top-down pressure onto the companies to make change, from my perspective.
This has been very wide-reaching. Now, minutes left. Let's bring it back to the beginning, which is how advisors should think about taking a step in investing. So 5 minutes, there's 5 of you. So 1 hot minute each. I'll go around the horn. What is a good first step, or what should an advisor be thinking about, something they can do in the short term? Sylvia, you go first.
Yeah, the future of energy consumption, storage, and use is going to change. So if you're an investor looking to get access to that, I would look at some of these renewable sources of energy, particularly selfishly hydrogen would be a good place to start.
At least you own it. Okay, at least you own it. Sean, go ahead.
Understand risk. We have some humdinger risks coming down the freight train at us. If you're not understanding what they are and thinking about how to stay ahead of them, you're going to get blindsided. Hey, the world is changing, and it's going to change very, very fast. There are opportunities in understanding that risk, and that's what the rest of the panel is about, the opportunities.
Really knowing what it is that you value, right? And I know that this seems a little, that you care about your children having the same opportunities that you did, then you have an obligation to protect the environment that they are then inheriting. But also, if you do care about being outdoors, if you do care about nature, if you do care about living in a world that you want to really reflect the things that you prioritize now and want to be able to do that in the future, then put that down and live in a way that does align with that. And the investments are a strong way to do so.
Shela.
Yeah, I was just going to say, more than risk, again, I'll go back to the opportunities. I think, to learn about what's happening all around us, because it's moving so fast, it's happening so quickly. There's this clear target that we have to reach by 2030 that the world leaders have committed to, that consumers and companies are all focused on. I do believe regulation plays a big part in that, absolutely. But I think there's massive trends, massive tailwinds. Like Sylvia said, clean energy, absolutely one of them. But it goes beyond that. It touches so much of our lives and the companies we work in. It's going to touch every aspect of what we do. So getting educated about that and understanding all the different implications, that's what I would say, massive opportunity.
And Dan?
I'd say first, understand your investment objective. Is it absolute returns? Is it impact? Is it risk management? That's key and will impact how you approach this market. And the second thing, I think, as everyone's alluded to, we've got this huge rising tide. In fact, we're surfing this tsunami wave that's coming. And my advice would be maybe try to avoid trying to do the stock picking or the ones and twos, and try to invest in a way that allows you to be spread across that rising tide. It's very hard to fail in the current environment if you take that sort of diverse approach, whether it's fixed income, commodities, equities, etc.
Great. This was, man, didn't we cover a lot? I mean, we got to everything, I think. Tesla, Bitcoin, we even squeezed those areas in. Thank you very much. You panelists did a great job. This is when I would tell the audience to give you a round of applause, but we can't do that. So just imagine everybody's applauding and cheering right now.